I'm delighted to welcome Christopher Wylie, formerly Director of Research at Cambridge Analytica, but most recently the whistleblower behind one of the biggest scandals to ever hit a technology company. Chris, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I've got to start by asking you about something that happened last night. Zuckerberg was in European Parliament. Did you manage to catch any of it?
I did. I caught all sort of 20 minutes of him talking.
Right. What was your general takeaway from the 20 minutes?
You know, it's a spectacle of non-answers.
Right.
You know, and it's bizarrely, Facebook's strategy seems to be go to testify, whether it's you know at Congress in the U.S. or whether it's the European Parliament or sending their CTO to the British committee, and then saying I'll get back to you, I'll get back to you, I'll get back to you. That's a good question. I'll get back to you. You know, sending the CTO to the British committee, and he didn't answer 40 questions. He's the CTO. He doesn't seem to understand his own company. So you know, I think that Facebook, its strategy is mistaken. I think because at some point it will create such a barrier of mistrust between itself and regulators and legislators that it might be shooting itself in the foot by the strategy.
Yeah.
I think that openness and transparency and having a really frank conversation, you know, would well serve Facebook, let alone the community at large.
Now, there was a suggestion from one of the lawmakers in the Parliament that Facebook should be split up, that it had a monopoly on its industry, and Zuckerberg fought back and said, no, we've got lots of competitors. What's your view on that? Should it be split up?
I think neither are true. I think there isn't a real competitor to Facebook for what Facebook is. I mean, that's like saying, I'm a car company, but there's competition in the oil market. So somewhere down the supply chain, there's quote unquote competition. But at the same time, when you look at technology, you do get benefits of scale. Right? You look at Google, Google's amazing because it's big. And frankly, Facebook is amazing because it's big. So when you look at the actual, if we take a step back and look at the crux of the problem is you have a dominating force in the market. In the same way that you would have a dominating force in the market with electricity companies or water companies. And so there's a question to be asked is the solution to break up a lot of these companies, or is the solution to look at how people actually engage and use the service? And in many ways, people use whether it's social networking sites or the internet in general as a utility. And so perhaps we need to start asking a question, are there essential services on the internet? And should we be looking at it through the lens of a utility rather than through the lens of market competition? Because I don't think that that just simply quote unquote breaking up Facebook or Google or what have you is necessarily going to solve the problem, because another company might just go and take its place. But there is a real issue when I've personally experienced the market dominance of Facebook myself, because when they decided to ban me after I told them that I was going to become a whistleblower, they took me off of Facebook, but they also, despite the fact that the Cambridge Analytica story had nothing to do with Instagram, they also took me off of Instagram. And it's not just those two sites. Like, if you have apps that require Facebook authentication, I no longer can use those apps. And so one of the things that I learned from that experience is just how one company, without any checks or balances on that power, can unilaterally delete your existence off of the internet. And the problem that I have with that is not, woe is me, I can't check out well-curated pictures of avocado toast in the morning, which
they
I do,
are very good.
which I do kind of miss. But so it's not about that. It's the thing that I really take issue with it is the fact that this is a company that has this power, and it's not just Facebook. I mean, there's other companies that also have that power, and that when it exerts that power, there is no check on that. And there's a serious question to be asked about our, that affects our democracy, which is that if a company has the power to unilaterally delete your existence off of the internet, or effectively large swaths of the internet, and there's no checks and balances on that, and they can do so at will when they disagree with what you're saying or when they disagree with you coming forward. There's a serious question about how that could be misused in the future, and are we concentrating that power? So it's a good question about splitting up splitting up companies and all that, but I think actually a better way of looking at it is through the lens of, are these essential services, and therefore should we treat them as essential services?
Well, take us back to the start, maybe the days leading up to the news breaking. Walk us through how that progressed. I know Facebook was, to put it lightly, not very keen on you saying what you said. How did that go down?
Well, I'll take one step further, because I have to give credit where credit is due. So I have to take a minute to talk about the amazing women at The Guardian and The Observer. So I was an anonymous source before I became a public and named source for the Cambridge Analytica story, and I started working with the authorities on reporting this, well before this big sort of story came out. But The Guardian approached me and they said, would you be willing to come forward and be a named source in this? And one of the things that we discussed was, well, is this just going to be another tech story or another data breach story? Because there's been countless numbers of data breach stories that are on page 8 of the technology section of a paper. No one really cares, even if it's like your MasterCard details. And I said, if you're going to do it, it shouldn't be a tech reporter doing it. No offense.
Point taken.
But it shouldn't be a tech reporter doing it, and it shouldn't also be a politics reporter doing it. And so what was amazing about The Guardian's approach to it is they took a team of women from the arts and culture section of The Guardian and The Observer, the Sunday paper for the Guardian, and they led that story. And what was great about it was that they made it translatable and understandable and digestible for people who weren't, technically minded or quote unquote tech bros, and made it accessible for those people, which I thought was really important. When we went and approached Facebook and let them know that this story was then coming out, their first reaction was to threaten to sue The Guardian. They said that it wasn't a data breach, and that they would sue The Guardian for defamation and whatnot. It's funny because later the CTO of Facebook at the parliamentary hearing in Britain said the reason they did that was because that's just how they thought it was done in Britain, that apparently you just threaten newspapers left, right, and center, and that was acceptable. That was actually his answer. So I spoke with them. I spoke with their vice presidents. My lawyer spoke with Paul Greywall. And the original conversation that we had was actually very conciliatory. I was quite keen on working with them. This was before the story came out. And quite keen on helping Facebook, first of all, come up with a response to it where they could come forward and talk about, these are the things, this has happened, this is true, we made mistakes, and this is what we're going to do about it. And we gave them that opportunity. And they originally took that opportunity, and then 2 days later, they announced, and I still don't know who decided in Facebook that this was a good idea. They then decided to issue a press release that said that they are banning me from Facebook, because they wanted to get ahead of the story. They knew the publication date from The Guardian, because The Guardian, in good faith, gave them that. And in an attempt to further punish The Guardian, they leaked the story to, or what they thought the story was, to other papers at 3 a.m. British time.
When we were asleep, basically.
Yeah. So the New York Times was working in partnership with The Guardian. And I get a call at 3 a.m. from one of the reporters at the New York Times, and he's like, we've got to go live now. They're trying to get us, And I'm like half asleep, and I'm like, okay, what's happened? And he says, Facebook is trying to spike the story, so we've got to go early, but we can't without The Guardian. So the New York Times then proceeds to wake up all the editors of The Guardian at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m.
It's a good way to make friends.
And yeah, by the way, the worst PR strategy you could ever employ, by the way, is to wake up a major international newspaper at 3 a.m. because you're trying to spike their story. And it wasn't just The Guardian, it was also Channel 4. So Channel 4 then had to figure out, how we have to now move all of our TV programming for the next couple of days to then fit in all of this, because Facebook thought that they could get away with it, but these papers were really determined to push this story out. And I think there's a real benefit with collaborating with different newspapers. One of the things I think a learning experience for all the papers was, yes, you're competitors, but sometimes you can make a story much more impactful if you actually work together. But so the story comes out. Facebook obviously is quite upset by it. But then 1 week later, they issue an apology for the whole thing and say, oh yeah, no, we're very sorry. I then, through my lawyers, reapproach Facebook and I say, okay, well, do you want to chat? They say, no, you're still banned. Oh, and by the way, we demand now all of your personal devices, your computer, your phone, all of that, because we want to inspect them. Which, by the way, they never did before. I mean, I had been corresponding with them before, back in 2016, which is how long they've known about this. And my response is, no, there is an ongoing legal investigation. We have regulators and public authorities with the jurisdiction over this matter. You are a party to that investigation. If I give you evidence that I have already passed on to the authorities to a party that may be under investigation also, that potentially is interfering with an ongoing legal investigation. And they never had even thought of that. They were so entitled that they thought, we can police ourselves and we can enforce whatever we want. They then get asked to appear at the British parliamentary inquiry. And Mark Zuckerberg continues and continues and continues to reject the invitation from the one committee that will actually ask tough questions and won't let him get away with, I'll get back to you, I'll get back to you, I'll get back to you. And the thing that I find absolutely astounding is that sort of everywhere you turn, Facebook seems to it thinks that it's trying to mitigate the reputational damage that it has incurred from this story. But the thing that I question is this a good long-term strategy? Because all it has been doing, and I can say this as somebody who's spoken to countless numbers of members of Congress, members of Parliament, MEPs in Europe, and elsewhere.
How many would you say you've spoken to in Congress?
50? I mean, 20 to 50. I mean, in Congress, I've talked to so many. And
on both sides.
On both sides, yeah. I've had some actually really good conversations with Republicans.
Well, I'm going to ask you about Ted Cruz in a few moments because you said something that I was not expecting you to say backstage, that you agreed with something he said. But we'll come back to that in a minute.
Sorry, I'm talking a lot.
That's why you're here. This is good. Everyone, fire up your polling devices. Sorry, that sounded a bit previous, wasn't it? Get your phones out.
We're going to do some polling.
We're going to do a poll because
that's my favorite. I love polling.
Well, then questions. Hold on to your hat.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how many people in here stopped using Facebook after Chris's revelations were published?
Does being banned count?
Voluntarily stopped using Facebook. Okay, hasn't affected my usage at all. So I'll be honest, that's sort of what I'd wondered. While this carries on updating behind us, how do you think your story and the revelations that you've made, how do you think that's resonated around the world? Do you think that the average person in the street has actively changed their opinion of Facebook as a result of this?
Well, I think one of the things that I find interesting is when you look at other examples of revelations about data or privacy or whatnot. So, for example, the Edward Snowden revelations. Those often had to do with government surveillance for others, right? So it's a suspected terrorist, or it's some fringe group or whatever. It doesn't affect me as a suburban mom in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've noticed from people who do come up to me on the street, because I'm easy to spot, unless I'm wearing a hat, and then I can sort of live in disguise. But is that this, because it has to do with Facebook and because it has to do with you and your data, and that what happened with Cambridge Analytica was a deliberate targeting of regular people in an attempt to manipulate and in an attempt to disseminate disinformation, so that you might be more prone, or people like you might be more prone to vote one way or the other, that it has I think, affected people's perceptions. And that also, I think the thing that's really actually affected it more is Facebook's response. Facebook could have come out, which they had the opportunity to before this story even came out, to get on it and say, there's lots of mistakes that have been made. There's lots of parties involved. We're going to figure it out. Let's have a conversation about it, and let's involve the people who are being elected to scrutinize. One of the things that I find also bizarre about Facebook's response is that, in Silicon Valley, there's this narrative about celebrating failure. There's this narrative about openness and transparency, even to the point where it's common for tech companies to reward white hat hackers for breaching into security systems, because now they know and they can fix, they can put a patch on or fix it or whatever. When a journalist goes and does that, or when civic society goes and does that, they shut down. And I think that is what is making people uncomfortable, is that the fact that they are so closed to criticism or even just basic transparency, answering questions rather than just always saying, I'll get back to you on it.
So for a social network, they've been pretty antisocial.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's ironic.
And they talk, and the thing that always drives me insane is when Mark Zuckerberg talks about the community on Facebook, but yet they are contributing to, an algorithmic segregation of those communities. Where's the public forum on Facebook? Let alone where's the public discourse that they are part of about Facebook itself. They talk about community, but currently right now it just seems like it's a bunch of targets to make money off of.
Well, let's look at this graph. What have we got? Okay, so I've hardly touched it since is actually slightly higher now than I'm a user and it hasn't affected my usage at all. I want to show a little chart. Kevin, somewhere out there, is going to put a chart up. Here we go. So this is fascinating to me. This at the top there is before Chris's revelations came out. This $100 billion drop in value of Facebook is this very obvious low point. And up there is basically present day within the last few days. So it crashed, it came back. Why is this company so resilient?
So the first point that I would say is that was not necessary. That crash wasn't necessary. Facebook had an opportunity to avoid that from the beginning.
Because they were silent for 4 days, 4 or 5 days. Right?
And so the first thing I would say is that wasn't inevitable. They could have prevented that from happening. In terms of the bounce back, so the first thing I would say is Facebook, by the way, I think is a great company in many respects. It does amazing things, and I think it's really important what it does, and it serves definitely a role in that market. So there is innate value to Facebook. So I think that is in part reflected in that. But the thing that I would say, and that I would caution when you're looking at it from the perspective of investors, is this story is the canary in the coal mine. This was not the only company that was abusing Facebook and social data. And secondly, regulations are coming. I mean, the conversation has absolutely shifted, and the mentality has absolutely shifted, both in regulators and in legislators. And so this, is a sigh of relief, but it's a misguided sigh of relief, because regulations will be coming.
Have you talked to members of Congress about regulation?
Yeah.
Are they keen?
Yeah.
Is it going to happen soon?
Does anything happen soon in Congress? I don't know. But the conversation absolutely has shifted. And when you talk, and by the way, this is not just Democrats. Talking to libertarian, small government Republicans who concede that this is maybe an appropriate point for government to step in and create some basic rules. And so the thing that I would say to Facebook, and the thing that actually I would say more broadly to other tech companies, is don't get dragged down because of Facebook. So just because Facebook isn't proactively engaging with legislators doesn't mean that if you're Google, you don't have to. You should go. You should be proactive about it. Represent the tech community and say that it doesn't have to be evil. I don't think it has to be evil. I don't think it is evil for the most part. I love tech. I love data. But there are some legitimate problems that we should be frank about. And if the company isn't frank about it, it will be on the back end of some pretty tough rules. And the unfortunate thing is some of those rules may not be appropriate for the long-term viability of a lot of the products that it uses. And there's a potential, which is one of the things that I'm concerned about, which is a ripple effect into other companies and other areas of tech that will be regulated in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense. But the only way to have logical, sensible regulation is to have an open and frank conversation about it.
Mm. So you were in Congress last week.
Yeah.
One of the things you talked about is how Cambridge Analytica had worked on certain slogans ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Can you talk us through what that was?
Yeah, so even back in 2014, that's when the company, after Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer acquired the intellectual property assets of SCL Group, which was the company that I originally started working on. That's when they decided to start testing messages like drain the swamp, or images of walls and people scaling walls, paranoia about the deep states watching you. A lot of the themes of the Trump campaign were tested very early on by Steve Bannon through this company, Cambridge Analytica, as far back as 2014. And while
he was still at the company.
While he's still at the company, yeah. And one of the things that I think he realized was that because there were a lot of underserved groups in the United States, and that certain frustrations that they had could be exploited or explained to them in certain ways that would be conducive to an alt-right agenda. Mm. And so, some of that message testing was used for that.
You, in Congress as well, you spoke about your knowledge of sort of Russian connections. What can you legally tell us about that?
Yeah, so there are documents and interactions that I'm aware of that, how should I put it, look awfully darn suspicious. There are things that haven't been published that involve references to Russian state security services, that involve known Russian or Russian-affiliated actors who were involved either with the company or in other projects for what became clients of Cambridge Analytica. And so I have just started working with the House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, on those issues. And my concern is that, in large part, I don't think that Facebook and other companies really realize that you aren't just a social network. Like, you have created a battle space for information warfare, and that creates real risk to our democratic institutions. And this is why I get so frustrated with the response, because I've seen things that are deeply concerning, and they seem to care more at the moment about maintaining their share value and their reputation than really speaking frankly about some of the effects that and activities that may have gone on during the past election cycle.
Have you been working with the FBI?
Yes.
And the ongoing investigation that they are pursuing?
I've been working with the FBI.
Okay. You were giving evidence to the UK in March. You said, "I think it is completely reasonable to say that there could have been a different outcome in the Brexit referendum if there hadn't been, in my view, cheating." Now, talk us through your thinking on that. What do you think needs to happen as a result of what you revealed with regards to the referendum?
Yeah, so the first thing that I would say is that in most democratic institutions, there are spending limits, and there are also restrictions on sharing data. The reason why there's spending limits is so that you have to listen to the voice of the people, not the paycheck of your next donor. Extending from that are rules of non-coordination, or what they call non-coordination, which means that different campaigns cannot work together. And the reason for that is so that you can't just give money to another campaign after you've hit your limit so that they can spend it for you. That is exactly what happened during Brexit. So a company that I was involved in setting up back in late 2013, Aggregate IQ, which became effectively a franchise of Cambridge Analytica, received 40% of vote leave spending. It also ran the digital campaigns of several other campaign groups. And what I have given to the Electoral Commission, which regulates electoral law in the UK, is a copious amount. If you stack up the binders, it's about that high, of emails, chat logs, et cetera, that show that there was a highly integrative relationship between all of these different campaigns that weren't allowed to talk to each other. Why is that important? Because if the vote was won by 2% of the electorate, and this is an irreversible change to the constitutional settlement of a country, not just Britain, but also the European Union itself, we can't come back from Brexit. And if there are questions about whether data was misused, as Facebook has now also evidenced in the fact that all of these different campaigns were using the same custom audiences and lookalike audiences. So if data is misused for targeting, if money was distributed to campaigns to effectively what appears to be an avoidance of electoral law, right? That we now have a vote. This is not just some little council race, that this is a fundamental vote that will affect the future of a country, not just many countries. Europe is just as affected as Britain. That if there's any question of illegality or rule breaking, law breaking, on any side of a referendum of such pivotal importance, what I would like to see is another vote. And the reason I say that I want to see another vote is because I want to be damn sure that this is what my adoptive home, Britain, wants for its future.
And you described it backstage not as a second referendum, but as a proper first.
Yeah, it's not a second referendum. If the first referendum had systemic cheating, then that is an invalid vote. And therefore, we should have the first free and fair vote to answer this question. And it is not about undermining the will of the people. You cannot undermine the will of the people by asking in a vote, what is the will of the people? You can't, it is not undemocratic to use more democracy. So if this is indeed what the British people want, then great, all the more power to them.
Do you have any similar concerns for the 2016 US presidential election?
There's a fundamental difference, right? Donald Trump is already president. Brexit has not yet happened. And so the real difference here is that there's an opportunity to prevent, if there was cheating, and if this vote was genuinely not reflective of the will of the people because of that cheating, there is an opportunity to prevent an irreversible mistake. And that is the real difference. And so that's why I care so passionately about it. And presented a huge amounts of evidence to the Electoral Commission. And Facebook has now come out and said, actually, yes, there were the same custom universes from all of these different entities on Facebook. There were lookalike audiences. This looks like it was actually just one large campaign that for reporting reasons just moved money here, 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 or here. But the law is the law, and we should respect the law.
You've been generally pretty open with your critics. You take criticism that you've received, pretty well. I would say. One piece of criticism that I've seen a few times is, whether you should have come out sooner about the revelations of Cambridge Analytica, prior to the election. And I'm curious, Do you wish you'd have come out sooner?
So, I was put into a very difficult situation because after I left Cambridge Analytica, I got sued, not just a couple months later, and in order to settle that. And by the way, that's not because I was quote unquote a disgruntled employee. It was because they were worried that I was going to talk about it. I signed what they call an undertaking of confidence or confidentiality, which is like a super NDA. And when you are facing, Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, one of the richest people in the United States, that's quite an intimidating experience. And also, it didn't become real to me, the effect of what this company was doing, until I started seeing its actual effect. And it was very soon after Trump got elected, which is when the Guardian actually approached me about it. And also that, I then started becoming an anonymous source to the Guardian, and then started working with regulatory authorities in Britain about the matter. And the thing that I would say about whistleblowing is that it's not, there's no moment where you just decide to go public. It's very much well, at least for me, it was very much a gradual process.
But the Trump vote was essentially the catalyst for what happened.
I mean, because the themes were so familiar and they just clicked in my head, and it was Steve Bannon who then started running everything, and the company got moved over. It felt chilling to hear that in public, and so for me that was concerning. And then also the revelations about Russian interference and the experiences that I've had and the documents and things that I've seen, which add to that narrative.
Is there more to come?
There very well could be, yeah. It depends on how an investigation goes.
Okay. Questions come in here on the app. How many more Cambridge Analyticas are out there? That came in from Paul Board.
Well, I think it speaks volumes to the fact that Facebook has now banned 200 apps and applications for abuse and misuse of data. This is a systemic problem for Facebook, but also for other social media companies. And what I was saying at Congress is that this is the beginning, it's not the end. Just because this, do not take comfort in the fact that this company has now closed, because it is the beginning of something. It is the canary in the coal mine.
When you decided to go public, did you anticipate that Cambridge Analytica would ultimately end up being dissolved?
I went public first and foremost because I think people should know about what happened, and also but I also was working with law enforcement and the regulatory authorities to make sure that if accountability is deserved, accountability is served. So it wasn't an intent to break the company. That wasn't my intent. My intent was to reveal wrongdoing.
What do you think to GDPR, which is coming into force on Friday this week?
Yeah.
Do you think that had that have been in force, a few years earlier, that it could have prevented?
No.
Okay, so it's pointless.
I'm not a fan of the GDPR.
What's the main problem with GDPR?
It is regulating technology 10 years ago. When you look at, for example, AI, so when you look at how the law regulates lots of other things, often it's regulating behavior. And the problem that I have is that, with AI, particularly moving forwards into looking into the future, because that's what laws should do. They should be prospective and look into the future. When we have a society moving forward where every device is a smart device. Every device becomes interconnected. All of a sudden, you're going to have algorithms that can make inferences about things without necessarily holding a particular database about you, or have the potential to. That when you look at AI moving forward, we should be asking questions about understanding, about memory, about inferences, about intention, in the same way that we regulate people. Because this idea that this is a data issue is like, for me, where in our brains do we store a particular knowledge of a word or anything? We don't. And so if we're creating smart things moving forward, and I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now, which is what we should be concerned about. Where in this AI is your data? Maybe it just makes inferences about you. Maybe it has access to your cousin's genetic data and makes inferences about the disease that you have based on the heritability of a disease that identified in your cousin's DNA. Now, is that data about you, or is that an inference? Is a decision being made? What is it that we actually want to regulate here? It's not, so for me, I think really taking a step back and asking questions like, is this just about data, and is this just about consent? Or is this about proportionality of use? Is this about reasonable expectations from that use? Is this about transparency, right? And the other problem that I have with the GDPR is I don't understand how it's going to work 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when everything is interconnected. Because if you walk into a building and it recognizes you, do you need opt-in consent for that to happen? Like, how is that going to work, right? So I think the intent of the GDPR is absolutely correct. But I think that this is why tech needs to be involved in the discussion about regulation. Because we need, if we have agile tech, if we have rapidly developing tech, we need agile legal frameworks. We can do that. That's not impossible. If you can build an agile company, you can build an agile regulation. But that involves companies like Facebook coming to the table and just talking about it.
And maybe they could start by coming to Britain and talking about it there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've got a big red sign in front of me and an editorial overlord over there waiting to come on, so we're going to have to leave it there.
It's very red.
The big red thing there, yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round. Christopher Wylie.